Hey everybody, it's James Lindsay. You're listening to the new Discourses podcast, and we are back into the Book of Woke. I don't have to give a long preamble this time. I think we can just jump in. These are going to be kind of shorter episodes, but I think I'm going to end up going through kind of a lot of this. I'm not going to go, however, in order if you guys are hunting down the book. I heard from a couple people who found it in their university libraries, and that's exciting. So I'm glad some people are looking at it. Again, the book that I call the Book of Woke is Critical Constructivism by Joe Kincheloe. I encourage you to go back and listen to the first episode in this series at the least. There will be more later, I guess, so it's the only one right now, to orient yourself. But the quick summary is this book, Critical Constructivism, a primer, which is in the Peter Lang Primer series by Joe L. Kincheloe, published in 2005, is the book I consider to be the Book of Woke. I introduced it in the previous episode by saying a while back I did a podcast about a book called Is Everyone Really Equal by Robin DiAngelo and Aslam Sensoy. And I called that book Woke for Dummies. And it's like the baby intro, you're majoring in something woke, so you're probably, a low ACT score or something in college. And it's your introduction to woke thinking. And this book is the grown-up version. This book, the introduction I gave before was when I first came across the idea of critical constructivist epistemology on Wikipedia, which does not have its own entry. I don't remember which entry it's on. I haven't bothered to look. And I read through this bullet point list of the principles of critical constructivism attributed to Joe Kincheloe. I was like, my goodness, this is what woke is. So this would have been like 2017 or 18, maybe earlier. It was certainly, I think it had to certainly be before 2017, but maybe it was later. I don't know. But at any rate, this thing that we were calling critical social justice or social justice ideology at the time was outlined as critical constructivist epistemology. And I had to eat some crow because I was a little bit grouchy with Jordan Peterson early on in Jordan Peterson's rise. And so I didn't like that he called it woke, what we call woke now. He called it postmodern neo-Marxism. And I thought, well, how pretentious is that? And I don't think it's right because I didn't buy the neo-Marxism part, but I bought the postmodern part. And as a matter of fact, I was too close to the paint, and I thought postmodernism and neo-Marxism were in too much disagreement to be fused. And it took me a long time to figure out that they fuse. But when I read about critical constructivist epistemology, critical means critical theory, and it's not like Joe Kincheloe is shy about saying that in this book. And constructivism means social constructivism. In other words, it is a philosophical position that is the same one adopted by the postmodernists. Okay, so in the previous episode of this series, and I don't know how many of these I'll end up making, we're just going to go for a ride through the Book of Woke so we can understand woke better for what woke really is. In the previous episode of this series, I went through some of the beginning of this book and outlined basically the definition of critical constructivism, an introduction to critical constructivism. So in this episode, I'm going to go a little bit deeper, and I'm going to read two segments from the first chapter that skip a middle part that I'm going to come back to, or a couple parts I'm going to come back to, about their views about science. That'll be, I guess, the next episode. But this one is about, this is all fancy terminology, understanding critical hermeneutics. And so I want to talk about what woke is from this perspective of understanding critical hermeneutics. In fact, this shows up in the book for those of you who end up playing along at home on page 20. And the section is titled The Power of Interpretation, Understanding Critical Hermeneutics. So we've already got some big words there, but they tell you what it's about, interpretation, right? So critical, we understand to be critical theory. Hermeneutics, we understand, I'm trying to see if he gives a definition of hermeneutics in here. He has a little glossary at the end of the chapter too. Hermeneutics is, it's interpretation, basically. It is a way of understanding, I would love to read his definition if he has one. Hegemonic, historicity, hyper-rationalization, he does not. Okay, so I'm sure he'll give one as we go into the text. But hermeneutics refers to it's like it's like interpreting something through an interpretive lens, right? So let me just read. We'll just go through that. Engaging, it's usually a word that you hear in kind of biblical analytics or something like that, that you're going to do a hermeneutic on the Bible in order to see it from a particular perspective, to understand what it is. Okay, so let's try this. Engaging, it starts off so dramatic and fun. This is just one of the sections, right? Engaging in critical constructivism, remember that means woke. Engaging in critical constructivism always involves the interpretive act, making sense of the complexity of everyday life and the data it constantly throws at us. So immediately they're going to say that the woke worldview, and I'm pausing to remind you from the previous podcast that he makes the point in defining critical constructivism that it is a worldview based on the constructivist approach to how we understand ourselves and the world, with critical theory attached to it. So here he's saying that it's not about data, actually. We have everyday life and the data it constantly throws at us, but there is always the interpretive act attached to it. And that's where woke lives. It's not what you see, it's how you interpret it. And that's the hermeneutics. And he's going to argue that we're going to apply a critical hermeneutic to everyday life and everything we see in the data. So, you can imagine, you have the data, you have to make sense of it, you try to figure out an explanatory framework, what it predicts and so on, and a critical theory hermeneutic provides a way to interpret the data. And this is where you're going to see everything is racist, everything is sexist, everything is, the sky is racist, going outside, going for a hike, nature, trees, dogs, everything, babies, everything. And that's because they have their interpretive frame, their hermeneutic is to read those problematics, they would say, out of a given situation, but really they're reading those problematics like racism and so on onto the circumstances that they're looking at. So imagine like the data are a bunch of dots, and you have to connect the dots somehow. Not like connect the dots like a little kid, but you're going to make like, this point connects to that point and the other point. And so the way that you end up interpreting the data would be a hermeneutical approach. And so if you have some rule of thumb, like always make triangles, that could be like a triangle hermeneutic on the data. And so they're using a critical theory hermeneutic to make sense of the world around them. He says critical constructivists are profoundly appreciative of the power of critical hermeneutics. If hermeneutics involves the act of interpretation, then critical hermeneutics involves understanding how power inscribes the word and the world to shape the nature of how human beings make sense of it. So those of you who followed along back when I did Paulo Freire and went through the politics of education in full detail will recognize immediately where he draws his inspiration from Paulo Freire, how power inscribes the word and the world. Remember that Freire's whole project, Paulo Freire, the Marxist educator who designed the critical pedagogy that Joe Kincheloe is a generation and a half, we'll say, down from, said that what you're doing is learning to read the word so that you can read the world. And he hasn't said that critical theory is basically the vehicle here, but it is about seeing how power inscribes, he says, the word in the world to shape the nature of how human beings make sense of it. And so I know these are close readings that I'm doing, and it's annoying because I'm never just like belting out the words that he says, so you can't string it together well. But the point is that power is inscribing something to shape the nature of how we make sense of the world. So in other words, power influences our sense-making apparatus. So it doesn't matter for the critical constructivist if the world is out there or not. All that matters is that we have to make sense of it somehow. And their claim with the critical hermeneutic is that we're going to analyze how we make sense of the data by saying that power is systemic structural powers like racism and so on are structuring how we read the world, how we understand the world, how we interpret the data. In fact, this is the same thing Marx called material determinism, really, sort of, not exactly. It technically means something different. But the idea was that your location with reference to the stratification of society of bourgeois versus proletariat worker versus bourgeoisie, oriented you to how you would understand the world fundamentally. Kinchlow goes on. He says, in other words, critical hermeneutics is directly concerned with how power enters into the interpretive act. That's as clear as you can get, except that he's not saying that we're using critical theory to analyze how power enters into the interpretive act. Critical constructivists, he says, start with the premise that all being in the world of human beings is an interpreted form of being. And whoa, that is not a small statement, guys. That is a profound philosophical confusion. We're in deep metaphysics territory here. So all being, that is an ontological claim. That is a claim about the status of reality itself. And he says that critical constructivists, so that means woke people, start with the premise that all being in the world, all existence in the world of human beings, is an interpreted form of being. So there is no unmediated experience. Everything has politics written into it and onto it. There is no neutral perspective. In other words, now I reiterate that you hear this, one of my biggest gripes with the kind of not insane Jew-hating woke right, the ones that don't do that, the ones who don't openly hate Jews and act like fools, is that they've conceded this point to the woke. They agree with the critical hermeneutic that there is no neutral perspective, therefore everything is an act of interpretation. Or as he phrases it, critical constructivists, including people on the moderate woke right and the radical woke right for that matter, start with the premise that all being in the world of human beings is an interpreted form of being. This holds profound epistemological implications, as all knowledge is socially constructed in a dialogue between the world and human consciousness. So if Kinchlow is right here, what he's saying is that if you accept the premise of the critical hermeneutic, that everything, there's no neutral perspective, everything's downstream from politics and power, he says there's a profound consequence in how we think about what we can and cannot know, because the consequence is that knowledge itself, what we consider to be worthy of calling knowledge, is also decided through a power-driven process. In other words, he's saying because all knowledge is socially constructed in dialogue between the world and human consciousness. In other words, humans are interpreting the world to decide what is and is not true, and knowing what is true is considered to be knowledge, that we have profound consequences in terms of knowledge itself to understand if we accept the critical hermeneutic from the beginning, or in fact, if we just accept the more benign interpretation of it, that there's no neutral perspective. We don't have to add the critical part necessarily fully, but I think that is the critical part, actually, now that I'm thinking through it in action. He says, educators who understand that knowledge and interpretation are inseparable terms work to enhance their interpretive ability. In other words, they lean into the hermeneutic. Indeed, the ability to generate rich and compelling interpretations is a key to producing more rigorous forms of knowledge and pedagogy. Okay, so that all sounds okay and interesting, except rich and compelling can mean a lot of things. They're doing a lot of work there. It reminds me actually of the Drag Queen Story Hour paper, in which they describe how the drag queen turns everything up to Technicolor, making the regular teacher seem boring and the regular lessons seem dull by comparison with the hyper loud, in their word is Technicolor, hyper real drag queen performance, which is maybe rich and compelling. Victimhood narratives are rich and compelling interpretations. So this is a anything that's got a grand meta narrative is a rich and compelling interpretation, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's correct. But he's saying that this is what's necessary within the profession of teaching. He says, long concerned with the theory and practice of interpretation, hermeneutics is a form of philosophical inquiry that focuses on the cultural, social, political, and historical nature of research. Hermeneutics maintains that meaning-making cannot be quarantined from where one stands or is placed in the web of social reality. Thus, in a hermeneutic context, interpretation is denaturalized in the sense that certain events and/or phenomena do not imply a particular interpretation of their meaning. Interpretation is far more complex than reductionists assumed, far more a product of social forces than Cartesians admitted. So he goes after the reductionists and the Cartesianists, or whatever, Cartesians, in order to, because those are his bugbears. And we skipped the part of the book where we did read in the previous episode a little bit of that, but he really goes after them in the part that I've skipped to get to this part. And so we'll hear about them later. I'm doing it a little bit out of order. Because I'm trying to present themes, not just read the book. And so here we have him saying the interpretation is far more complex. And actually, the next episode that I record will be about complexity theory and its relationship to this. And we've talked in the past, and it's very important to reiterate, the reason woke people want everything to seem really, really complex, even though their analysis is always really, really simple. Let me tell you a critical race theory analysis of everything. It's racist. And we're done. So that's literally how simple it is. It's always that. It's call everything you want to control racist until you control it. That is the practice of critical race theory. I made that the first sentence of my book, Race Marxism, about the subject for that reason. They want everything to seem hyper complex. And the reason they want everything to seem so complex is because if it's super complex, you have to defer to an expert to understand it. You couldn't possibly understand something that's so complicated, but the experts, the gurus, always seem to have the right answers. There's a wonderful essay, and now I can't think of who it's by a feminist who criticized Judith Butler for this. A very famous essay called her the Professor of Parody. It'll probably come to me at some point. But this essay is just on another level for explaining this phenomenon of Judith Butler being famous for her hyper-complex sentences or very difficult writing. It's never quite clear whether or not she said something for most people, and then what she says is really impenetrable. And so the criticism is that it forces her students to come to her for the interpretation of everything. And they refer to this as the author refers to this as a guru dynamic. And so this is key to the critical constructivist or woke approach, is everything's complicated except to the woke person who can then clarify it for people who have to listen to them. It's literally what cult leaders do, is make everything in the world seem scary and complicated, except that they have the interpretation that allows you to navigate it safely. So he goes on. Thus, critical constructivists focus great attention on the act of interpretation in research. They have to, because they don't have the data, they don't have the facts. They are spinning interpretations. It's all narrative driven. They are making narratives based off of the facts so that they can convince people that they are in this intrinsic oppressor versus oppressed dynamic. And if you're oppressed, you need to rise up. And if you are oppressor, you need to stand down. So thus critical constructivists, that means woke, focus great attention on the act of interpretation and research, appreciating the distinction between describing a phenomenon and understanding it. So they're trying to put the idea of the material physical sciences on a lower standing than them. Oh, yeah, you guys describe what happens in reality really well, but that doesn't mean you understand it. There's a higher level understanding, and that understanding, say it's critical race theory is the critical hermeneutic you're using, is it's racist. But they have to pretend it's really complicated and that they've invented something complex. And what they actually are doing is just talking about a bunch of social relations and tiring everybody out, pretending it's complicated. And what you're like is, well, how do I make these people shut up and be happy? And that's complicated because they don't want to shut up or be happy. And then you give in. And that's kind of the name of that game that they play. So informed by hermeneutics, critical constructivists understand that any act of rigorous knowledge production involves connecting the object of inquiry to the many contexts in which it is embedded. So that's how they make it complicated. They connect it to a bunch of contexts. Well, from this perspective, it would be this, and from that perspective, it would be that. Remember in the previous episode where Kinchelo gave the example of people from different countries watching a baseball game and then trying to interpret the baseball game? A Chinese woman from the border of Mongolia would see the baseball game this way, and a stock trader would see the baseball game this way, and the manager would see the baseball game this way as a way to make money or whatever, blah, 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 blah. But the fact of the matter is what was elided in that analogy, as I explained previously in the other podcast, is that all those different perspectives don't matter for what the baseball game is. The baseball game is still the same thing. It doesn't matter how people see it. And if you give people enough time to watch enough games and get exposed to the idea of baseball, they're all going to converge on telling you the same thing about what's going on with a baseball game. So connecting the object of inquiry to the many contexts in which it's embedded allows them to switch the frame and basically confuse. It's smoke and mirrors until they can say something's racist and extract power. So appreciating this is a bullet point list. That was the first bullet point. Next point. So it also, critical constructivists understand that any act of rigorous knowledge production involves appreciating the relationship between researcher and that being researched. So by making it all relational, they can make it complex, and they can insert that, there's a power dynamic, and somehow that's important, and they're the only ones who understand the power dynamic, so they have to control what happens. Next, connecting the making of meaning to human experience. So that's fine. That's not necessary for interpreting an awful lot of data, by the way. Making use of textual forms of analysis while not losing sight that living and breathing human beings are entities around which and with which meaning is being made. So you're starting to hear this theme of meaning making. That's what this is all about. So that's the point of this podcast. So when he talked about, it being a worldview, a Weltanschauung, now we're turning around and he's talking about being a meaning-making structure. So when we're making the case that woke is a religion, it is a worldview, and now he's talking about an awful lot orbiting around this idea of human beings relationally being meaning-making engines, and that the critical hermeneutic is going to be used to be the meaning-making engine. It's how you're going to extract meaning from what you're seeing, doing, and experiencing. And that makes it very religious. When I studied the psychology of religion like 15 years ago, I was struck by that the authors conclude that there are three primary purposes, psychologically speaking, for human beings to be religious. They're not trying to explain Christianity or anything else. They're saying what psychological purposes, what psychological things are satisfied by being religious. And they take a very empirical approach, and they come up with three primary things. One is a sense of control, including self-control. One is a sense of community, and one is a meaning-making structure, a way to make sense of the world around them and place themselves within it. Next, any act of rigorous knowledge production, according to the woke, must involve building a bridge between these forms of understanding and informed action. That's a really nice way of saying that we're going to teach you that the world works according to Marxist meaning-making structures, and you have to become an activist. And then he says I think it's the last bullet. I don't think there's more bullets on the next page, but maybe. Understanding that rigorous teaching always involves applying these concepts to any subject matter engaged in the classroom. So this is a totalizing approach as well. The critical hermeneutic is not something that you apply here and there when it's appropriate. It's totalizing. It applies to everything in the classroom. You will critically analyze every aspect of classroom life and educational experience, including the content. The material becomes an excuse for consciousness raising or radicalization. That's critical pedagogy in a bottle, according to Paulo Freire's model of it. But also the structure of the classroom, the organization of the classroom, the down to like the schedule, everything has to be brought under the heel of the critical hermeneutical lens. And that means what you're going to do is you're going to make critical theory a totalizing worldview that becomes a meaning-making structure for the people that are analyzing it, and it's going to be embedded in deep false complexity so that the leaders of this cult structure are able to always be the ones that you turn to, because it's too complex for you to make determinations for yourself. You constantly have to go take this paralogical nonsense, make-believe critical constructivist world and bounce it off of the experts. Remember, the point of the critical constructivist worldview that we talked about in the previous podcast is that there is no shared reality between people. Shared reality is approximated through similar group experience of oppression or maybe privilege. There is no shared reality. Reality is constructed by the subject, by the subjective observer. That's the constructed part of constructivism. So perception, there is no reality that precedes perception. So there's no objective world out there, or if there is, there's no capacity in us to read it in an objective way, and therefore we have no access to it, and that's what we already heard here. So we have no access to reality as it is. Everything is an interpretation. And so if you lack the ability for there to be an external frame of reference that we can all agree exists and that we can come to agree upon, the only thing you have as your arbiter for when people are getting right and wrong answers about the world are the people who claim to be more advanced in understanding the world through the subjectivist lens. You'll notice that these people do not believe that because everything is subjective, that everything is equally right. You can't give you can't give a racist answer in a critical race theory classroom if it's racist against black people. You can't do that. That answer is wrong. Donald Trump can't come out and say he's trans because immediately an expert would appear and say, no, he's pretending and making fun of trans people. And they know. What this does is it creates dependency on people further up the ideological chain. And that's what this whole structure is about. And their meaning-making structure is therefore a cult meaning-making structure. This thing operates like a religion, and it gives people meaning by wedding theory to praxis. It gives them something to do, and what it does is meaningful, but they are not able to discern reality for themselves because reality is subjective and located against political power, and they have to talk to other people further up in the cult to rightly understand, so it's called rightly understand, how that political power works. Because they understand the theory, so it's theory driven. So their activism is going to be downstream from that, their meaning making is going to be downstream from that, but they are unable to determine reality for themselves outside of the cult and the higher level cult members. That's how critical constructivism and critical hermeneutics work. So critical hermeneutics has engaged in a dialogue, he tells us, with the tradition of critical theory. No, do you think so? The word critical didn't tell you. Okay, understanding our previous conversation about critical theory, extending, not understanding. Extending our previous conversation about critical theory, it is always concerned with the ways power operates and the ways various institutions and interests deploy power in the effort to survive, shape behavior, and gain dominance over others. I urge everybody at this point to remember the iron law of woke projection never misses. So what they're interested in is shaping behavior and gaining dominance because that's how they think power works and they covet power. Right? All Marxists believe the same thing, is that they're going to be able to take power in order to responsibly steward power to its end. The difference between Marxists and fascists is they believe they're going to be able to take power and steward power to the maintenance of the hierarchy that makes society successful rather than abolishing the power structure itself, which, by the way, the Marxists never actually do. But I digress. It is always concerned. Critical theory is always concerned. Thus, critical hermeneutics are always concerned with the ways power operates and the various institutional and various institutions and interests, the ways that they deploy power in the effort to survive, shape behaviors, and gain dominance over others, or in a more productive vein, improve the human condition. Realizing that power is not simply one important force in the social process is not simply one. Critical theory understands that humans are the historical products of power. So if you're woke, you believe this: human beings are the historical products of power. Men and women do not emerge outside the process of history. Human identities are shaped by entanglements in the webs that power weaves. Critical hermeneutics emerges in the dialogue between hermeneutics and critical theories concerned with power and social action. Okay, so the critical hermeneutic, the critical theory, believes that your identity has been brought to you by the historical circumstances, the power dynamics in which you are embedded. I would argue that the woke right see your historically handed identity as put upon and challenged and has to be recovered and protected, and woke left see it as something that you are being oppressed by. this is the way the world views women, and you have to be this way. And that'd be woke left, and they hate it. And then the woke right would be, this is the way that the world should view women, and we lost it, so society won't be good till we get it back. But you're still a product of your historical contingencies, and you actually will see the woke right, in addition to the woke left, saying that, nations are the product of a historical process, and the people within them are the product of that history. In this hybrid context, Kincheloe says, critical hermeneutics pushes interpretation to new levels, moving beyond what is visible to the ethnographic eye to the exposure of concealed motives that move events and shape everyday life. Like, if you're on the woke right, that the Jews control everything, and if you're on the woke left, it's that everything's a racist conspiracy. Turns out, by the way, that critical race theory and QAnon are the same exact program. They're exactly the same. Anti-Semitism and critical race theory are the exact same program. There is a group of people who have made themselves, they've hoarded all the resources of society, and they are cheating everybody else out of them, and it is the duty to expose and destroy them for this. So in this hybrid context, we'll read that again. Critical hermeneutics pushes interpretation to new levels by bringing in the critical theory, moving beyond what is visible to the ethnographic eye to the exposure of concealed motives. So they can read minds because of their enlightened subjective status. That's why they would know if Donald Trump said he was trans, that he's not really trans, and that he's actually trying to make fun of trans. That move events and shape everyday life. As critical hermeneutics observes, the intersection of power and omnipresent pre-reflective cultural meanings, a sensitive and rigorous understanding of the social world begins to take shape. Critical hermeneutics takes the concept of historicity to a new conceptual level, as it specifies the nature of the historicity that helps produce cultural meaning. The consciousness of knowledge producers and teachers, the construction of the research and teaching processes, and the formation of human subjectivity and transformative action. So that's a lot, but that's what woke is actually all about, okay? So what does it say historicity is? Historicity, the human state of being in the world, our place in space and time, and the way it shapes us. Okay, so who you are as a product of history and an agent in history is your historicity. Critical hermeneutics takes the concept of historicity to a new conceptual level, he says. So what does it say that it does? It specifies the nature of the historicity that helps produce cultural meaning. So culture is a historical force that we have to understand through Marxist-type historical analysis. The consciousness of knowledge producers and the teachers. So it's a historical process that we've come to that leads people to believe certain things are knowledge and that should be taught. That goes also, he says, the construction of research and teaching processes, how we're going to interface with knowledge and acquire more of it and then teach it, is also the result of a historical process that needs to be analyzed through the lens of power dynamics having shaped it. The construction of the research and teaching process, I already said that one, and the formation of human subjectivity, who you are and who you see yourself to be, and transformative action, what kind of duties of conscience you adopt, to use the proper legal language for religious designation. In this interpretive context, critical theoretical concerns with praxis-based notions of social change are more easily addressed as social action informed by thick description and rigorous understanding of a social and political circumstances made possible. So we'll come back to thick description in a second. Praxis he defines as an activity that combines theory and practice, thought and action for emancipatory ends. So it is a theory-driven and theory-informed approach to doing something, but he says specifically for emancipatory ends. In other words, that it's specifically for a Marxist objective of breaking free of the existing status quo in society. So what does this crap mean that he said this thick understanding, right? So again, in this interpretive context, critical theoretical concerns with praxis-based notions of social change, that's Marxism, by the way, critical theory with praxis-based notions of social change. He says they are more easily addressed under the critical hermeneutic. Then he says, the reason is because social action informed by thick description and rigorous understanding of social and political circumstances made possible. So what he's saying is, outside of having a critical hermeneutic or outside of using critical theory, it's not possible to really understand what's going on in society. You actually are wrong. You can't be listened to or taken seriously. It's not just that we don't share reality. It's that you don't have a thick enough understanding of the circumstances. You don't understand rigorously in what he says, thick description. You have a shallow understanding or a thin understanding of what's going on around you. So you can't really inform discussions or action because you don't really understand what's going on. What he means by a thick description and rigorous understanding of social and political circumstance is that you've adopted a critical Marxist analysis. So you've joined the cult. They have a thick understanding. You have a thin understanding. So the cultists, according to the cult, have to be the ones who explain and do everything. This is just another way for them to use the idea to power, that it's all a power grab. He says, in this critical hermeneutic process, we begin to get down to the forces that move events. Again, it's the same thing. They understand everything better. They understand, as Kamala Harris said repeatedly, the root causes. The root causes are always social inequality and the conflict between classes that need to be identified and really, frankly, accelerated. But they're the only ones who understand. You have to understand that this is the key. They are finding ways to say, we're better than you, therefore we deserve power because we're more awake and more enlightened in our own sight. But they have to dress it up in a way that sounds like, oh, actually, we're really smart and we have a better understanding of things. But the fact is, they just think that they are cult awakened. They are awakened to a cult view of reality called critical constructivism. And by dint of being critical constructivists, they understand the world better. Or as the woke right would say, they know what time it is, right? Nobody else knows what time it is. We know what time it is. We know the solution. Nobody else has solutions. We have solutions. These are woke right lines, but the woke left is the same thing. They have the exact same thing because they have, in the critical hermeneutical process, we begin to get down to the forces that move events, like the post-war liberal consensus on the woke right and on the woke left, like structural racism. Jewish power maybe on the woke both sides. We begin to uncover what schools and other institutions hide about how the world really works. Does that sound like fucking Tucker Carlson? Sorry, I didn't mean to swear. Doesn't it sound like Tucker Carlson, Ian Carroll, Daryl Cooper, increasingly Joe Rogan? We understand what they're all hiding from you. So I went on a podcast. I believe this was when I sat down with Winston Marshall and we were arguing about woke right while I was at ARC in London, and we were talking about it, and a lot of people said this was very eye-opening to them, and I repeated this somewhere else on another podcast or more later, but I tried to make the point, and it's a difficult point, but here's the book, this is what I'm talking about, that people who are woke have adopted a knowledge-producing rule of thumb, a heuristic, that is that which has been hidden from us was hidden from us on purpose, therefore it's more true. That which we are not allowed to know, or those questions we're not allowed to ask or seek answers to, are things they don't want us to know. So I told Winston Marshall, the essence of woke is that there's a they out there. This could apply to any position. It doesn't have to be left, right, or anything. There is a they out there. White supremacists, Han chauvinists, great Russians, whatever the thing, it doesn't matter. There's lots of context that we could come up with. Post-war liberal consensus neocons, there's a they out there. They don't want you to think and do certain things. So the things they don't want you to think and do must be more likely to be right. That is a woke heuristic on knowledge. Here it is. In this critical hermeneutic process, we begin to get down to the forces that move events. We begin to uncover what schools and other social institutions hide about how the world actually works. What we learn in this context can be quite disconcerting. But why bother learning at all if we're not trying to get an honest picture of the phenomena in question? If I could do a reliable Tucker Carlson impression and read those last couple of sentences in his voice and then did the maniacal laugh, you'd be like, oh no, that's exactly the same thing. I can't do it. I was going to try. I can't do it. I can do the laugh. In the first decade of the 21st century, we are far better acquainted with these interpretive dynamics than we were before the paradigmatic changes of the last 4 decades. The argument put forward in this paradigm shift assert that, and again, there's 5 bullets here. I'm going to number them, but they're bullets. 1, there is a distinction between the world and our linguistically driven interpretive perception of it. So there's the world, probably out there, not necessarily from their perspective. And then there's the way we talk about the world, which is completely different. There is a distinction between the world and our descriptions of the world, which are, they're going to argue, always interpretive, and the interpretations are always colored by power. 2, Eurocentric American patriarchal and elite class inscriptions can be found on most of what schools reference as, quote, validated knowledge. So there's a woke left interpretation. Let me just put this in. You know, it could be Israeli American, dual loyalty, Jewish, feminist, whatever, neocon, neoliberal class inscriptions can be found, anti-white can be found on most of what schools reference as validated knowledge. Same exact idea, woke left, woke right. 3, all phenomena can be viewed from multiple vantage points. Perspectives gained from these vantage points change the ways we understand phenomena. That's just their appeal to complexity. They don't really care about that, because this is where Lenin's idea of raznobratia was, that you would have diversity in form leading to unity in content. 4, there will always be new and unanticipated vantage points from which to view the world, thus meaning is not as stable as we once imagined. And 5, all knowledge is part of larger processes that are in flux. As the process evolves, the knowledge once thought to be stable changes along with it. So in other words, knowledge is actually relative to the circumstances that you're in and who has the power to define those circumstances, even if that's social power, just what everybody believes, or the questions you're not allowed to ask, or the answers you're not allowed to give or seek. While many scholars have come to understand these paradigmatic dynamics, such a change should by no means be seen as universal. As previously maintained, there is still tremendous resistance to such a new way of thinking about knowledge and, in turn, education. Are you ready for a punch in the eye? Here we go. Hermeneutics promotes a dialectical notion of understanding that seeks to free knowledge production from the authoritarian explanations of the certified experts, whether they are the religious elite of the medieval period or the scientific elite of modernity. Let me give you the definition of dialectics that he gives, and then we'll have some fun with that, won't we? Because Joe Rogan just had his controversial debate, which is the modern word for 2 people who disagree squabbling, or in that case, a 2-on-1 against somebody who disagreed with them, squabbling on a podcast, with Douglas Murray versus Dave Smith and Joe Rogan. And so anyway, dialectics, here's what he says. Dialectics understands that knowledge is not complete in and of itself. It is produced in a larger process and can never be understood outside of its historical development and its relationship to other information. I would not give that definition of dialectics, but these guys cover up basically everything they do, so here we are. Let's go back to that fun sentence. Hermeneutics promotes a dialectical notion of understanding that seeks to free knowledge production from the authoritarian explanations of the certified experts. Oh boy, right? And he says whether it's religious experts or scientific experts. Oh boy. Dave Smith in this Joe Rogan debate, whatever it was, directly said, thanks to COVID-19 and the institutional distrust we rightly have now, and maybe some other things, that we don't need experts anymore. Now, I dare say that he's not thinking of his pilot when he says that. I bet you he strongly cares whether his pilot is an expert in flying and, more importantly, landing aircraft. I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure I could get a 737 off the ground. I'm mostly convinced I could control it while it's in the air to a limited degree if everything goes smoothly, and I'm virtually certain that I'm going to kill everybody on board if I try to land it. And so he probably cares about expertise in a situation like that. He might care about expertise at his doctor, but when it's spouting off political opinions is what he actually means. We don't care about expertise. In fact, he might say that it promotes a notion of understanding that seeks to free knowledge production from the authoritarian explanations of the certified experts. Woke. In the modernist context, hermeneutics resists scientific explanations that reduce the world to what is objectifiable, that is, expressible in mathematical terms. Again, this is the same thing. Like, actually knowing what's going on correctly is being resisted. And it's claimed by this perspective, critical constructivist perspective, that the experts in any given subject with genuine expertise, I don't mean credentialed people, I don't mean people who went to college, I don't mean authorities, I mean people who actually know what the hell they're talking about, who can actually land the plane, whether they have a pilot's license or not. Do you follow me? The pilot's license is a certification. The ability to land the plane is real, okay? That's real expertise. And so in the modernist context, hermeneutics resists scientific explanations that reduce the world to what is objectifiable. In other words, objectifiable, what is real. He says mathematical explanations, bullcrap. Objectifiable, real. He really should just say objective, but he's trying to say objectively true in a different grammatical context. So hermeneutics resists those. So again, when we say we don't need to listen to experts say about what's happening in Israel or what's happening in any other conflict in the world or what's happening with tariffs or what's happening in political arenas or whatever else, or medicine or any other field, you got some crazy people in there. You got some great people. You got some crazy people. Let's be real. We don't need to listen to experts, right? When you go, there's like, you don't want to be just an obedient sheep who listens to everything. The saying in the Soviet Union was trust but verify, right? But you also don't want to believe everything. Richard Dawkins used to famously say, have an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out. And that is kind of the point here. But critical hermeneutics, well, just hermeneutics, he says, resists the scientific explanations that reduce the world to that which is objectively determinable. Think about that. When we don't need experts at all anymore to understand correctly what's going on in the world, everything's opinion, and opinion is really legitimated as Jean-Francois Lyotard, the great, awful postmodernist who wrote The Postmodern Condition in 1979, what he described as legitimation by parology. Legitimation by parology is the idea that consensus, whatever you can convince people of, is generally true. That's actually the thing they're criticizing here, but what they're also saying is that's actually how it works. The thing is they want to be considered the only credentialed experts. And because they're not the credentialed experts at the moment, just like the Duesbergs are not the credentialed expert. Duesberg, by the way, is a portmanteau. It's a fancy word that combines Jew and Spurg. Spurg is short for Asperger's. Asperger's is a variety of autism. And so Duesberg means to act with autistic super focus and obsession on Jews being the cause of everything. So Duesberging means blaming the Jews for everything. So I lost my train of thought. But if you're going to be one of these people, so the Duesbergs are outside of the accepted knowledge base. So all of a sudden they don't care about experts. I guarantee you that if they were to become considered the experts, they care about experts, and you're not an expert because they are now. I guarantee you it's this way. I promise you it's this way. I know it's this way because this is how the woke work. The woke are the only friggin' experts on racism. Nobody else is allowed to know a single thing about racism. And the Jewanon or Duesberg, Jew haters, I'm trying to think of words that avoid the anti-Semitism word because that one's kind of poisoned. These guys are absolutely convinced that, they're the only authorities on when something is and is not anti-Semitic, when something is or is not Jewish power, and so on. They call themselves noticers as well, as in they're noticing that everything's controlled by Jewish power. That's what that means if you're a normal person who doesn't live on the internet. This focus Kincheloe tells us, on understanding and interpretation, rejects unilateral experiences of all kinds that too often eventuate in oppression via the hyper-rationalization of lived experience. Such explanations are couched in the monologic of correct and incorrect answers. See, we don't care about those anymore. That's monologic, correct and incorrect. No, it's just opinions, it's perspective. We're just putting it forward. Like Joe Rogan argued very strongly with Dave's support against Douglas Murray that Daryl Cooper, when he gives his revisionist history of World War II, is just putting forth his perspective. And if you listen to him, you can tell he really cares. He's really interested. Doesn't matter that he's just rehashing Irving's old conspiracy theories or revisionist history. Doesn't matter that that's what he's doing. He's putting it forth. He cares. Here it is again. I'm telling you, this is woke right. Such explanations are couched, the ones that you're resisting, right, are couched in the monologic of correct and incorrect answers, a way of researching that subverts critical analysis as it imposes meanings. That's what they're doing. It's what Daryl Cooper and all these guys are doing on the woke right. They are imposing meanings, and they reject the monologic of correct and incorrect answers because that logic of having to actually be correct or incorrect, quote, subverts critical analysis, which is what they're actually doing. What these guys, these Jewsbergs, are doing is critical Israel theory. What Tucker Carlson does when he does critical Israel theory often dips into critical America theory. It's a critical theory. What a lot of libertarians do, not all libertarians, they're doing a critical government theory, where government itself is always to be held in this idea of criticism. And it's not a healthy way to go, but this is what we're describing. Such material is packaged for easy consumption. Right and wrong answers packaged for easy consumption. No interpretive activity is necessary. Do you understand why they like complexity now? Because when it's too complex for right and wrong answers, now we can just throw forth opinions, and all the conspiracy theorists and the woke and the whatever else are on equal ground. No interpretive activity is necessary, meaning when they're in the monologic of correct and incorrect, just throw it in the explanatory microwave heat and insert into one's memory. Hermeneutic understanding, unlike rationalist, that's a great way to start, right? Hermeneutic understanding, unlike the rationalist one, or reductionist explanation, does not launch a preemptive strike against other ways of producing knowledge. What a pile of horse shit. They have literally, this is page 24, he has literally just spent 23 pages of this book explaining how the scientific process asserts a power dynamic and that it's ignorant of the fact that it does it. It literally has launched a preemptive strike against anything except the critical constructivist view. Everything that disagrees with critical constructivism is just an application of power that the critical constructivism exists to expose and call out. It literally, iron law of woke projection never misses. It's so beautiful. He says, when I argue in The Sign of the Burger, McDonald's and the Culture of Power, 2002. Let that just, I didn't write that. That's not a grievance studies paper. The Sign of the Burger, McDonald's and the Culture of Power. That McDonald's can be understood as a semiotic phenomenon in its strategic deployment of cultural signifiers. This does not mean that George Ritzer's McDonaldization thesis is wrong. All right, I don't know what the fuck. Just get a drink. Just go get a beer. And I'm not a doctor. Something health advice, disclaimer, alcohol consumption, something bad for you. Indeed, the two ways of interpreting McDonald's seem to me quite synergistic. This is part I was actually going to skip, but we're going through on a harder line today. So, like I said, critical hermeneutics asserts that meaning is consistently multiple in nature. Why? Because they're gurus. They're going to tell you which ones count and which ones don't. And once they're in power, let me assure you that will no longer be the case because they're right. In a culture infiltrated with the ideology of the superiority of scientific explanation, such multiplicity seems to many inherently lacking in standards. So the critical constructivist or woke war on science is overwhelmingly profound. I hope you're getting the sense of that. Thus, he's going to conclude this part. Thus, critical constructivist scholar teachers informed by hermeneutics become rigorous researchers of context, perspective, and discourse. Not actually the thing, just the things around the thing. Drawing on the concept of bricolage, I don't remember exactly what it is. That's his invention. I'm not getting into it. They understand that they must use multiple research traditions. Oh, that's what it is you got to use all the different perspectives. They understand, drawing on the concept of bricolage, they understand that they must use multiple research traditions and theoretical tools to understand the way these factors influence how we make sense of the world around us. Bricoleurs appreciate that any research that fails to account for these dynamics cannot produce a complex, thick, and textured picture of a phenomenon. Empirical quantitative studies that take these factors into account move toward the criteria of rigor. Teachers who understand these dynamics move toward a new realm of educational quality as they break free from the reductionism that stupefies in the name of edifying. So all he's saying there is that the critical constructivist perspective, the woke perspective, is better, and the people who don't understand it are stupid. And in fact, as you adopt more of it, you become more rigorous because you've made things more complex and introduced more room for critical theory, interpretation, wiggle room, jockeying contexts in order to, like I said, Marxism is a series of bitch moves that polite society doesn't know how to respond to. And so what they're going to do is create room, wiggle room, where it's no longer a monologic of correct, incorrect, where you can say, yeah, but don't you think, or it's kind of true. Don't you think what he said is sort of true? Well, he has a point. And then you have all this wiggle room to inject radicalizing propaganda into the circumstance. Now, if you recall from the previous episode, this book is organized into around 12 points that define critical constructivism. I did not go through those 12 points because they're scattered through the book. So we've now encountered point number 3. I have not read to you point number 2 yet because it is in the part that I skipped, but I read to you point number 1, so just in case you're keeping tabs. Point 3 of how critical constructivism is defined and operates. Interpretations cannot be separated from the interpreter's location in the web of reality. One's interpretive faculty involves understanding how historical, social, cultural, economic, and political contexts construct our perspectives on the world, self, and others. Therefore, what it's saying is everything's interrelated, and your positionality, who you are in the socio-political economic hierarchy, determines who you are, how you understand the world, how you were treated and how you understood in the world and treated by it, whether what you think is knowledge or not knowledge by the people that have the power to consider things to be knowledge or not, blah, blah, blah. So it's the positionality doctrine. The knowledge that critical constructivist researchers produce, he tells us, is grounded on the assumption that the world is shaped by a complicated, again, there's the complexity, web-like configuration of interacting forces. Yeah, systems of power is what he means. Knowledge producers, like everyone else, are inside, not outside the web. So you don't get to say that you have an objective stance. You're part of the political, social environment too. As previously mentioned, he tells us the knower and the known are inseparable. They are both part of the complex web of reality. This is just mystifying bullshit. No one in this web-like configuration of the universe can achieve a godlike perspective. No one can totally escape the web and look back at it from afar. Indeed, critical constructivists argue that we all must confess our subjectivity. We must recognize our limited vantage points. So this is a way that they sound humble, but they're not. What he's actually saying is that there's no objective position. So what he's implying is, and this is what they believe, is that there's no way to have objective knowledge. Everything is political. and everything therefore needs to be politicized. But this is also, again, the main thing that, again, the kind of lightly woke right people have conceded this point. They accept point 3 of critical constructivism, and that is there is no neutral vantage point. That's what he actually said. Everybody's in the web. There's no point of neutrality. So nobody has an objective perspective. No knowledge is actually better than others. It's the invitation to relativism, and the only answer in a relativistic frame to why you should adopt this perspective or that is force. It might be coercive force of the crowd. It might be state force, but it's the only way that you have, because you don't have an external objective point of reference that everybody can access and check against. To recognize, he tells us, how our particular view of the web shapes our conception of social, psychological, and educational reality, we need to understand our historical location. Reductionistic cause and effect educational research tends to ignore the way our historicity works to construct our consciousness. In other words, who we are and the position of our society and its historical forces constructs our consciousness. But remember, in the critical constructivist world, consciousness is what interprets perception, and nothing exists before the interpretation of perception through consciousness. Therefore, power shapes consciousness. Your historical position, your historicity, constructs your consciousness. So the power dynamics that have made you who you are uniquely in this position in time and space and history, your social location, your economic standing, everything, has conditioned your consciousness or constructed your consciousness, and your consciousness is constructed as a way of interpreting your perception, and that interpretation of your perception is real to you. It is your lived experience or lived reality, and it is intrinsically, from this perspective, knowledge. And if it's oppressed, it's intrinsically highly valued knowledge. So as a result, he says, our concept of social activity and of the educational process is reduced to a static frame. Traditional reductionist forms of curriculum development ignore this web of reality and its impact on the production of knowledge. Curriculum and instruction in this context are delivered to passive students as truth, as free from construction by human beings from particular points of this web of reality. Maybe you find all this mystifying stuff philosophically interesting. Maybe you're invested. Maybe you like it. I don't know. And I honestly don't care. I can tell you this. What the hell does this have to do with teaching a second grader how to add 2-digit numbers together? At the end of the day, that's really what we're getting into. They want interpretive frameworks everywhere to introduce all of this radicalizing social conversation to your kids. But you read, traditional reductionist forms of curriculum development ignore this web of reality and its impact on the production of knowledge. And you're like, my kid can't add. My kid cannot add 2 numbers because you're making him draw a bunch of friggin' boxes and I don't know what it means, and neither does he. Oh, but if we don't, it's all reduced to a static frame. Curriculum and instruction are delivered to passive students as truth. Yeah, well, guess what? 17 plus 17 is 34. It's just true. Period. The end. Teach my kid to add, right? All this high-minded bullshit is also this weird cover-up for the fact that, especially at the elementary and junior high levels, there's not a hell of a lot of interpretation going on. You are actually, in elementary mathematics, you are primarily teaching basic algorithms. We call them things like adding and long division, but you're teaching them very basic algorithms and getting them competent in being able to do those things. That's actually the point. It's not this, whatever the hell web of reality, social production of knowledge crap. None of this is relevant. Thus freed, he says, from a spatial, and talk about losing the plot of education completely. Thus freed from a spatial and temporal location in the world, the reductionist positivistic researcher feels empowered to make predictions. Well, yeah, they send spaceships to Mars and stuff and don't miss, so they predicted that the spaceship would go to Mars and not miss. They predicted that when you drove over the bridge on the way to work today, that the forces that were going through the bridge with the varying amounts of traffic on it would be transmitted down through the various structures of the bridge into the foundation so that you don't fall into the river. Yeah, they are feeling empowered to make predictions because that's the point of this. That's the point of all of this. The point is that you have explanatory capacity and you have the capacity to make valid predictions that bear out when tested, and that anybody can do those things and observe the results, and that you do so adding the fewest moving parts, which is called parsimony. So you don't need to add loopholes and twists and turns of racism and bridge design in order to figure out all of the mechanical forces of a frickin' semi-truck going across the bridge so that it doesn't fall in the river. Thus freed from a spatial and temporal location in the world. This is our reductionist, boring teachers who don't understand anything. The reductionist, positivistic researcher feels empowered to make predictions, to settle questions. Well, how much money went in and out of the bank today? To ignore the dialectical process in which all social activity is grounded. No, this is a cult based on dialectical nonsense, like a lot of cults are. Dialectics is really a cult way of thinking. It comes from the Hermetic cults. From this perspective, linear mathematics controls variables. No, it doesn't. Linear mathematics describes variables. One's dependent, one's independent, or sometimes more than one. Eliminates extraneous perturbations. Yeah, you don't want that. Like, you don't want your bridge, like, shaking and wobbling. And paints a Norman Rockwell portrait of the schoolhouse. Like, this guy's just on drugs. Obviously, the type of knowledge and curricula produced by reductionist science is very different from the information produced by critical constructivism and their educational researchers. Yeah, no kidding, because you guys are crazy and you're Marxists and you're not actually producing anything real. This is a point missed in most discussions about education. Where does the knowledge of school come from? What? Where are the assumptions embedded within it? What roles do such knowledge play in shaping our consciousness? It's like, sir, just teach my kid to add 2-digit numbers. Like, can he read a book? And please God, does it not have to be about some social drama that you can whip up into some narrative? From the perspective of Ilya Prigogine, somebody won a Nobel Prize in chemistry. From the perspective of Ilya Prigogine, I don't know how he says his name. You want it spelled Prigogine, the 1977 Nobel Prize winner in chemistry and proponent of complexity and chaos theories. Reductionist pseudo-linear science distorts the knowledge we construct about the world. Okay, fantastic. So all of a sudden you find your Nobel Prize winning scientist in chemistry that you hold up on a pedestal because he has a Nobel Prize in chemistry that you just said is a reductionist scientist or science that you're not supposed to do it. And he said something different, so he's an authority, so we listen to him. So why does it matter that he has a Nobel Prize in chemistry then? It doesn't. He and the analysts of complexity realize that pseudo-linear simplicity does not work. Sir, teach my kids to add. Like, really? A so-called extraneous perturbation, an outside change, falling into the complex interactions that we have referred to as the web of reality, can produce an expanding exponential effect. I think he's talking about Soros's reflexivity there, but I'm not positive. Inconsequential entities can have a profound effect in a non-linear universe. The shape of the physical and social world depends on the smallest part. The part in a sense is the whole. So here we are with the Marxist holism, or really the Hermetic holistic thinking. The part in a sense is the whole. For via the action of any particular part, the whole in form of transformative change may be seen. That's just actually not true. I don't want to break it to you, in the web of physical reality, actually most motion is random, small, inconsequential completely, and cancels out. It's called Brownian motion. In the web of social reality, most things are literally completely inconsequential. They have no reverberating effect through history. They just don't matter, including probably the podcasts like this. It just doesn't matter. And I guarantee you the science that he just talked about, he doesn't understand it. He has no grounds to stand on to use that, but he uses it as a symbol, like a lot of his postmodern forebears, especially feminists, to try to saw the limb of science out from underneath him. It's absolutely preposterous. That's what Jürgen Habermas, another critical theorist, called a performative contradiction. He's relying on the authority of science to undercut the authority of the sciences. It's only authoritative for him when it agrees with him, because he's a critical theorist or critical constructivist. It says to exclude such considerations is to miss the nature of the interactions that constitute reality. Notice how New Age all this sounds? It's because it's basically the same thing. It's like being New Age but mad about it is critical theory. Critical constructivism's complex reconceptualization of research, meaning guru-driven, and the knowledge it produces does not mean that we simplistically reject all quantitative forms of empirical science. Oh, they agree. They keep the parts that agree with them. Right. They don't get rid of all empirical science. Many questions in the world and in education involve counting, figuring percentages, averages, means, modes, and so on. It does mean, however, that we conceive of such empirical questions as one part in the web of reality. So it's a big, more complex thing, so they can discard the parts they want and keep the parts that they like, right? As one part in the web of reality, that is, the interactive configuration of the world around us. A critical constructivist reconceptualization of knowledge production means recognizing, as John Dewey did decades ago, that the knower and the known are intimately connected, that a science that separates fact from value, purpose, and belief is a pseudoscience divorced from the complex lived world of human consciousness. Again, every time this guy gets all high-minded, just teach my kids to read and not this crap. Such a reconceptualization reminds knowledge producers that we can display our content and argue for its value, but always with hesitation, a stutter, a tentativeness, never as the final truth. Right, so that the gurus always have standing to keep pushing whatever they need to do and discredit whoever they need to discredit. He has a definition here for complexity theory. Complexity theory posits that the interaction of many parts gives rise to the characteristics not to be found in any of the individual parts. In this context, complexity theory studies the rules shaping the emergence of these new characteristics and the self-organization of the system that develops in this autopoietic, self-creating situation. Okay, fantastic. So why bother with all of these issues of constructivism, epistemology, research, and complexity theory in something as simple as teaching skeptics? Skeptics may ask. Grammar matters, put a comma. The reason is that all of these features tacitly shape the nature of public conversation about teaching, and they covertly shape how all of us view the purpose of schools. The models of teaching we are taught, the definitions of research that support our inquiry, and the angles from which we view intelligence and the modes of learning that shape the way we think all emerge from these issues of knowledge production. Literally just teach my kids to add some numbers. Like reality itself, schools and classrooms are complex webs of interactions, codes, and signifiers in which both teachers and students are interlaced. Just as complexity theory asserts that there is no single privileged way to see the world, there is no one way of seeing the classroom, seeing intelligence, or seeing teacher or pupil success. In the present era of top-down standards and standardized instruction, there is only one correct way to see all of these concerns. Critical constructivists find that frightening and socially destructive. So did you hear all that? That was the key part right there, right? Just as there's no single privileged way to see the world, there's no one way of seeing the classroom, intelligence, teacher, or pupil success. So now you can introduce all the crap for equity, right? You can say, well, we don't have to just measure success in terms of actually being able to read. If your kid can't read, that's okay. There are other ways to measure success as well, and we don't have to worry about that. So here again, I'm not going to go into the next parts because we're a little bit over an hour, getting to an hour and 15 in that sweet spot for this. So this is the idea. I went into the complexity theory stuff, which was kind of going to be most of what we were going to talk about next time. So it's an introduction for next time. But this critical hermeneutics part, and really I think is clarifying to what it means to be woke. This book, Critical Constructivism by Joe Kinchelow, is the book of woke. And what it explains is that being woke means adopting a interpretive framework that always sees power dynamics that you believe shape and structure the world that you live in, mostly to exclude your group from power. It's always really at the end of the day that. that those are the most relevant explanations. So whether you're questioning systemic racism as a critical race theorist, or cis heteronormativity as a queer theorist, or patriarchy as a feminist, or bourgeois values as a communist, or capitalism as a communist, or maybe you're questioning Han chauvinism as a member of the CCP, or challenging the nationalist construction by the Kuomintang in China before the CCP took power, or to address the ethnic minority distribution question in China and the relationship with the Han majority and the CCP. Maybe you're trying to address Russian chauvinism against the Ukrainians and 1926 Soviet Union. Maybe it's any of these things, or maybe you're questioning Jewish power, or a post-war liberal consensus that has structured a neoconservative regime that boxes out other views of conservative thought to make sure that they are not allowed back in, that right-wing thought is not allowed to be a part of conservatism, is the way that they actually phrase it. Most of the woke right, by the way, reject being called not just woke right, but conservative. They do not see themselves as conservative. They explicitly believe that they have adopted critical theory, and so they come from a critical hermeneutic, and that they are right-wing who have been excluded from conservatism by virtue of being truly right-wing. The right wing is something different, and it is what they are, and that they have been shut out, and that they are now coming back to prominence. And so the woke right, I don't care that they're actually not right-wing. I think they're actually left-wing. But the fact of the matter is that they claim for themselves the true status as right-wingers, sometimes as conservatives. So it doesn't matter if they believe in Jewish power, if they believe in neocon power that's boxing them out, or if you're a CRT guy believing in white supremacy, or you're a Soviet in 1926 believing in great Russian chauvinism, bearing down on the Ukrainians, which was a cynical ploy by Lenin and Stalin to make use of the ethnic minorities around Russia to grab power in Moscow. It doesn't matter which one of those situations you're in. You're woke. That's woke. That's critical constructivism. That's adopting the critical hermeneutic. And so all of these things are the same thing, not necessarily in content, but in essential form. So they are operating the same way, same operating system, and talking about different issues, which necessitates them being talked about in slightly different ways. There is a fundamental difference between, as I've said many times, between left and right in terms of the woke orientation, which is that the woke left is claiming oppression in the name of fighting oppression, and the woke right is claiming oppression in the name that oppression is what made things work and is therefore good. So we're going to fight that's why the left has a way better PR campaign than the right, and the right scares the crap out of everybody. The woke right says oppression is what made us great, so we're going to make everything great again with more oppression, and the left says oppression's really bad, give us power, and we're going to get rid of it, which is a way better PR campaign, but otherwise they're the same program. And what we discussed today out of the book of Woke, which is the book Critical Constructivism by Joe L. Kincheloe, it is a primer in the Peter Lang Primer series of educational books. What we learned today is that the critical hermeneutical frame, in other words, that everything is interpretation, and the interpretation has to be done all of our understanding of the world is interpretation, I should say, and that interpretation has to be done in light of the way that power dynamics have located you as a social and historical and economic person in the so-called complex web of reality that only critical constructivists are fully aware even exists, and therefore even have a hope of understanding with their thicker understanding of reality that thus confers upon them the right to tell people that you don't know what time it is. It's time for us to take power and rule.